Rain had already begun to fall when the house came into view, a tall silhouette standing alone at the end of a gravel path that looked as though it hadn't been walked in years. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way old houses sometimes are, but it carried a strange pull, like a whisper brushing against the back of the mind, urging a step closer. The air around it felt heavy, as if every drop of rain was being dragged toward the earth by something unseen. The front door was slightly open, swaying the way something breathes when waiting for a visitor. The moment I stepped inside, the sound of the storm vanished. No echoes, no dripping, no distant rumble. Just silence, thick, padded, unnatural. The walls smelled of dust and old wood, but there was something else beneath it, something faintly metallic that clung to the throat. I told myself it was just the scent of age. But when the door closed behind me on its own, the temperature seemed to drop low enough to freeze a breath in midair. I walked deeper into the hallway, boots leaving small prints on the dusty floorboards, but when I turned to look, there were more footprints than just mine, older, blurred at the edges, as if someone had stood there for a very long time. The lights flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale glow down the narrow corridor where shadows curled like fingers reaching for movement. The house felt aware. Curious. Almost relieved that someone had finally arrived. That was when I tried to leave. Only a few minutes inside, and the unease crawling along my spine begged for escape. I reached for the doorknob, twisted it, and stepped out into the rain, only to find myself standing once again in the same hallway, the same dim light humming, the same dusty footprints waiting beside my own. The doorknob slid from my hand with a soft click, and something deep within the house seemed to exhale, as if settling in for a story it had been waiting too long to hear. The first return begins as a moment of confusion so small it almost feels laughable, the kind of strange slip the mind blames on tiredness or distraction, yet it carries the seed of something much darker. It begins when the protagonist tries to leave the house for the first time, thinking nothing of it, believing the creaking floors and strange quiet are just part of settling into an aging structure. They grasp the doorknob expecting cool metal, and instead feel something slightly warm, as if someone else had held it only seconds before. The unease is soft but present, humming beneath the ribs like a low vibration. They tell themselves it's natural, leftover heat perhaps, anything but the possibility that the house itself responds to touch. The moment the door opens, it should bring cold rain or the wide grey of the outside world, but it doesn't. It brings the hallway again. Nothing has changed except the sensation that the air is heavier, denser, like stepping through a curtain into a space that recognizes them. They blink, then step backward, thinking they've turned the wrong way or walked through a loop by accident, though the house isn't large enough for such disorientation. A step becomes two, and their heartbeat begins to climb the walls, searching for logic in a place where logic is loosening its grip. The floorboards beneath their feet feel different now, not merely old but attentive, as though they carry vibrations that respond to movement. The protagonist touches the door again, pushes it open with more force, expecting resistance or a draft, but the door glides easily. And again, the same hallway greets them, unchanged but wrong all the same. Light falls in the same slanted shape across the floor. Dust hangs in the same unmoving line. Even the air smells identical, heavy with aged timber. They open and close the door repeatedly, hands shaking now, each attempt becoming more desperate than the last, but the result never varies. No matter how wide they swing the door, no matter how much force they put into stepping forward, they remain inside. The outside world becomes something remembered instead of experienced, the kind of memory that feels increasingly distant with each heartbeat. A creeping sense of impossibility begins tightening around the mind. They try windows next, but they don't budge. The glass feels worn to the touch, not like sunlight or heat from the room, but as if something presses back from the other side. Curtains drift slightly although there is no breeze, and the silence in the house deepens until it feels like sound has been swallowed whole. The protagonist speaks out loud, calling into the stillness, and their voice sounds too small, too fragile, like it doesn't belong here. Time begins to warp in small ways. Minutes stretch into long threads that feel like hours. The protagonist tries again and again to reach the exit, each attempt more frantic, each repetition leaving them with a sinking realization that the door is no longer a boundary to the world, but a threshold controlled by something unseen. Panic simmers beneath their skin, but they try to steady themselves, rationalize, break the tension with reason. Houses don't choose where their doors lead. Houses don't loop space. Yet this one does. They try touching the walls and find them strangely smoother than before, as though the house is shifting in subtle ways, adjusting itself. The wooden floor creaks not under their weight, but in patterns that sound almost conversational, as if answering their movements with its own. They take a deep breath and test the staircase, thinking maybe the upper floor will give a new perspective. But climbing the stairs gives no comfort. Shadows cling too closely. The air grows colder the higher they go. When they reach the landing, they feel watched, not by eyes but by the structure itself. They descend again, determined not to lose control, determined to confront the door one more time with full force. Their hand trembles as it reaches out. The doorknob pulses faintly, like a heartbeat. They pull the door open with a surge of adrenaline, step through, and collapse into the same hallway yet again. The realization settles with a weight that cannot be shaken off easily. The house does not intend to let them leave. This is not a malfunction or a trick of perception. It is deliberate. It is intelligent. And most terrifying of all, it is patient. The protagonist leans against the wall, breath unsteady, pulse racing, trying to understand what force could twist space like this. They whisper to themselves for reassurance, but the words sound thin against the thick silence. They realize now that the house is not merely shelter. It is not a place they inhabit. It is a place that inhabits them. It has accepted them, or perhaps selected them, drawn them in like a fisherman draws in a net. The first return is not just a physical phenomenon but a psychological blow, the moment the house asserts its nature, revealing itself not as a structure but as a boundary between the human world and something colder. The protagonist tries to think of others who might have lived here before them. The dust on the floorboards, the footprints they saw earlier, the lingering warmth on the doorknob, all of it paints a picture they don't yet want to understand. Something about the house feels old in a way that has nothing to do with time and everything to do with hunger. The walls hum faintly as though pleased with their confusion. The protagonist closes their eyes and steadies their breathing, but the dread lodged in their chest refuses to move. They know now that whatever brought them here was not chance, and whatever waits deeper inside has no intention of letting them go. The shifting walls begin as details too small to take seriously, the kinds of things a tired mind dismisses as misremembered angles or tricks of shadow. At first, the protagonist notices the hallway feels slightly longer than before, but they blame it on anxiety, on the way fear stretches perception. Yet when they walk the hallway again, counting their steps this time, the number doesn't match what they recall from only minutes earlier. The house seems to breathe around them, expanding and contracting in ways that mimic a living organism testing its boundaries. The wallpaper, once peeling only near the baseboards, now shows fresh curls along the top edges, like it has subtly shifted to a new height. The protagonist touches the seams, but the patterns remain perfectly aligned, as though the wall itself elongated without disturbing a single detail. As they continue exploring, doors that were firmly shut before now stand slightly ajar. A room that used to open into a narrow storage space suddenly reveals a wider, deeper interior filled with shadows that swim along the edges. The protagonist steps inside cautiously, unsure whether the room has truly changed or whether their memory is betraying them, but the air gives them the answer. It feels colder here than in any other part of the house, a deep, sinking cold that smells faintly of damp soil, as though the foundation lies exposed beneath the wooden floorboards. When they back out, the room feels like it pulls at them, urging them to step further in, testing their willingness to surrender to the shifting environment. The next time they pass the same room, the door is gone entirely. Where the frame once stood, there is now only an unbroken stretch of wall, smooth and pale, leaving no sign it ever existed. The protagonist stands there, breath thin, mind reeling at the impossibility of a room vanishing within minutes. They run their hand along the wall, pressing firmly as if expecting the surface to bend or ripple like fabric, but the wood remains solid beneath their fingers. The absence of the door feels deliberate, an erasure done with intention. They begin to understand that the house does not simply trap them, it rearranges itself to suit their movements, watching, responding, adapting. As they wander deeper, the hallways develop impossible angles. A corridor that once led straight now bends unnaturally, forming a crooked turn sharper than any architectural logic would allow. The walls themselves seem to hum faintly, vibrations lightly tapping against the skin like distant whispers. The protagonist presses their ear to the surface of one wall, half expecting silence, but what they hear instead is a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood, or something shifting on the other side. The sound is rhythmic, too steady to be mere settling of an old house. It feels alive, purposeful, waiting. Each step they take feels guided by the structure, as if the floor chooses where to tilt its weight. Sometimes the boards underfoot creak not directly beneath their shoes but ahead of them, as though something walks just out of sight, anticipating their arrival. The protagonist begins marking corners with objects from their pockets, coins, bits of paper, anything to ground their sense of direction, but the objects vanish within minutes. In their place, they find small traces of something else, smudges that resemble fingerprints, scratch marks too deliberate to be accidental, and once, a strand of hair that does not belong to them. Every disappearance and reappearance feels like the house is rewriting itself, absorbing what it wants and discarding what does not serve it. The rooms themselves behave like traps disguised as familiar spaces. The kitchen, initially cramped and mundane, gradually elongates. Cabinets stretch taller, towering over the protagonist like hollow sentinels. The window above the sink begins shrinking day by day, the frame pressing inward until the glass resembles a narrow sliver barely wide enough to allow light through. The protagonist stares at it for a long time, realizing that the outside world is becoming less visible, less accessible, not just through the front door but through every opening the house once offered. The house is closing itself, drawing in its own edges like a creature protecting its core. In the living room, the protagonist swears the fireplace was smaller earlier, but now the stone arch rises in a hungry curve, drawing the eye into its darkness. Shadows pull inside it, deeper than any natural dark, and the air shifting from its depths feels warm in a way that suggests something within it is breathing slowly, asleep or pretending to sleep. When the protagonist turns away, the crackling sound of embers follows them, even though no fire burns within. The sensation of being observed grows heavier, coiling around their spine with every shift of the walls. At night, the house changes more boldly. The corridor outside the bedroom moves from left to right. The window switches positions on the wall. The ceiling seems lower, pressing down as though testing how tightly it can confine the body beneath it. When the protagonist wakes after a restless sleep, they find the bed closer to the door than it had been when they closed their eyes. The distance shrinks incrementally each night, as if the room itself is nudging them toward something waiting beyond the threshold. The protagonist tries to document these changes, scribbling notes on scraps of paper and marking positions with lines drawn on the floor. But each time they return to review their notes, the handwriting appears more distorted, letters stretched or compressed like the house's influence bleeds through the ink. Some notes shift meanings entirely, words rearranging themselves into phrases they never wrote. The protagonist's attempts at grounding reality only reveal how easily the house manipulates every physical aspect within its grip. Eventually, the shifting walls force the protagonist to confront a growing dread: the house is not changing randomly. Every alteration feels like a calculated move, tightening an invisible net. The hallways lengthen when the protagonist seeks the exit, leading them deeper instead of outward. Doors vanish when they attempt to escape. Rooms appear only when the house wants them explored. It rearranges itself like a labyrinth with a sentient keeper, one that anticipates every choice before it is made. The realization cuts deeper than fear. The house is studying them. It watches their reactions, notes their habits, tests their boundaries. The shifts grow more pronounced when the protagonist resists, and subtle when they surrender, as though measuring the perfect balance between hope and despair. Each change serves a purpose. Each warped angle, each disappearing doorway, each impossible room is part of a design they are only beginning to understand. The whispering floorboards begin as faint murmurs, so soft they could be dismissed as the normal settling of an old house, the subtle rearrangement of timber under shifting temperature. At first, the protagonist barely notices them, too overwhelmed by the strange behavior of the walls and the impossibility of leaving. But on the third night, when the silence grows too deep and every corner feels too watchful, the floorboards start speaking in a language made of creaks and groans that follow a rhythm far too deliberate to be accidental. The house does not settle, it communicates. The protagonist lies in bed, struggling to steady their breath, ears tuned to the sound beneath them. The footsteps begin at the far end of the house, slow and measured, dragging slightly as though something heavy is pacing across the wooden floor. The sound grows clearer, louder, moving with purpose, drawing closer inch by inch. Each footfall presses into the silence like a deliberate intrusion, as if the house is testing how much noise it can make before the protagonist reacts. They hold their breath, counting the footsteps, hoping the pattern will break, hoping it will fade. It doesn't. The pacing stops directly beneath their bedroom. Silence fills the air, but it is an expectant silence, tight and hovering, as though something beneath the floorboards is listening for signs of wakefulness. The protagonist clenches their teeth, refusing to shift or breathe too loudly. The wood beneath the bed groans in response, and for a moment, it feels as though the floor itself is subtly rising, bowing upward to brush against the underside of the mattress. They picture, against their will, a shape pressing from below, an unseen form creeping along the beams, adjusting its position as if aligning itself with the figure lying above it. When the whispering begins, it is so faint the protagonist believes it to be the rustling of their own bedsheets. But the sound sharpens, grows clearer, until it forms a soft, breathy rasp too controlled to be natural. It is a voice formed from the strain of wood, a voice that should not exist, a voice that somehow shapes their name with a dragging, splintered quality. They freeze, every muscle locking in place as the whisper slides under the bed like a cold hand. The voice repeats the name, drawing out the vowels as if savoring the sound, as though tasting the presence of someone newly trapped. The protagonist almost responds out of instinct, but something deep within them urges absolute stillness. They realize in that moment that acknowledgement might be invitation. The whispering continues, shifting tone, forming noises that mimic words but never fully become them, as though the house attempts to speak through the brittle language of its aged structure. The voice travels along the beams, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other, as if searching for an opening, a crack, any place where it can rise through the floor. The protagonist imagines it pressing its mouth, if it has one, against the boards, exhaling stale air through the thin gaps. The atmosphere grows colder, thick enough to taste, leaving the sensation of dampness clinging to the back of the throat. When morning arrives, the protagonist hopes daylight will quiet the house, but the whispering floorboards only evolve. Now, footsteps follow them in the daytime too. When they walk through the hallway, something walks beneath them, mirroring their pace but always a fraction of a second behind, as if studying their movement before repeating it. Sometimes it pauses when they pause, but other times it continues a few extra steps, lingering beneath them with an unsettling slowness, as though circling or observing from below. The protagonist takes to walking on their toes, trying to move silently, but the floorboards still respond with faint groans even when they make no sound. It becomes clear that the house does not need noise to track them. It knows where they are at all times. As days pass in warped succession, the whispers start rising from places the protagonist never expected. They hear them through the walls, the ceilings, even from the staircase. Soft murmurs seep from the seams between floorboards, drifting upward like smoke. Sometimes the whispers resemble breathing, slow, steady, too controlled to belong to someone frightened or lost. Other times, the sounds resemble scratching, as though fingertips or nails drag along the underside of the wood. Once, while standing motionless in the center of the living room, the protagonist hears a low, guttural hum vibrating through the boards, a sound that feels more like a creature purring than a house creaking. The house, through its floorboards, begins to anticipate their fear. It plays with timing, knowing when the protagonist is least prepared. In the deepest part of the night, when exhaustion pulls at their eyelids and rational thought slips into a fog, the footsteps begin running, fast, frantic, darting back and forth beneath the bedroom. The sound mimics panic or excitement, like something below them has grown restless or impatient. The protagonist squeezes their eyes shut, knowing the worst thing they could do is get out of bed. But staying still feels like offering themselves to whatever waits beneath the boards. The choice becomes its own form of torture. At one point, in a moment of desperation, they press their ear to the floor, hoping to hear only silence so they can convince themselves the horrors are imagined. Instead, they hear a faint whispering chorus. Not one voice, but many led atop each other, some sharp and angry, others soft and mournful. The sounds bleed into each other like an overlapping tangle of trapped souls or echoes of those who walked the halls before them. A single whisper grows louder than the rest, forming a shape that once again resembles their name. Then another voice joins it. Then another, each one speaking with different tones and depths, some high and brittle, others low and rattling. The floor vibrates beneath them as though the entire house is gathering itself to communicate in unison. The protagonist jerks back, heart pounding, knowing now that whatever lives within the floorboards is not a single entity but many, or perhaps one presence with countless voices. Either possibility chills them. They understand at last that the house is not just shifting physically around them. It is expressing itself. It is speaking. It is remembering those trapped before and responding to the newest occupant with growing familiarity. Every whisper, every footstep, every creak is a message. And the most terrifying part is that the house is still learning how to speak clearly. The discovery of the previous tenants begins with a subtle but undeniable pull, a sense that something in the house wants to be found, wants to be acknowledged, as if the walls themselves hold their breath waiting for the protagonist to stumble upon what has been hidden for far too long. It happens on a day when the silence feels heavier than usual, when the shifting walls have settled into an unnatural stillness that feels more like anticipation than rest. The protagonist senses something different in the air, a tension that presses at the edges of perception. They wander through the house with a mixture of dread and determination, tracing their fingers along the walls, listening for the secret heartbeat of the structure. Their search leads them to a narrow hallway they have walked through many times, yet something is different today. The wallpaper near the end of the corridor seems to be peeling in a way it hadn't before, curling outward as though trying to reveal something beneath. When they tug at the loose corner, a thin sheet of plaster cracks, exposing a dark seam. The sound echoes too loudly, as if the house reacts to the disturbance with a jolt of displeasure or warning. But curiosity, sharpened by fear, pushes them forward. They dig deeper, pulling away more fragments until they uncover a small wooden panel sealed with rusted nails. The wood is old, darker than the rest of the house, as if it has absorbed something over time. They hesitate before prying it open, feeling the weight of an unseen presence pressing against their back, urging them to stop or perhaps urging them to continue. When the final nail comes free, the panel shifts outward with a sigh that sounds disturbingly like relief. Behind it lies a shallow cavity filled with dust that drifts into the air like ancient breath. Inside the hollow space, arranged with deliberate care, are objects that make the protagonist's blood run cold. A child's cracked toy horse, its paint chipped and eyes scratched away. A faded photograph of a woman with no date or message on the back. A leather wallet with worn edges and a missing identification card. A brass ring tied with string around a yellowed scrap of paper. Each object feels heavy despite its size, heavy with history, heavy with the presence of the people who once touched them. The dates carved faintly into the wood beneath each object strike the protagonist as strange. Every date marks only a short span of time, never more than a month. Some as brief as a week. None extend longer than 30 days. Yet there are no names, no descriptions, no clues to identify the owners. Only the haunting suggestion of lives that started and ended within the confines of the house. A chill spreads through the protagonist's bones as they realize the dates mark occupation, not ownership. These were not people who lived here long enough to leave willingly. They were people whose time inside this place was cut short. As they sift through the objects, the house groans, a deep, resonant sound that vibrates through the floorboards and up their legs. The air grows denser, oppressive, as though the house disapproves of this intrusion into its memories. The protagonist feels watched, not by eyes but by the lingering essence of those who came before. They sense despair in the air, a residue of fear trapped within the walls. The objects begin to feel warm in their hands, like they hold echoes of the people who clutched them in their final days. The child's toy feels especially unsettling. When the protagonist lifts it, the wooden horse emits a faint clicking sound as if something inside shifts on its own. The photograph of the woman draws their attention next. Her face is blurred, not by time but by something else, as if her features were never allowed to settle fully into the world. The longer they stare at it, the more distorted it seems, her expression changing subtly depending on the angle of light. At times she appears frightened, at others exhausted, and sometimes her eyes seem to follow the protagonist, pleading silently or warning them to run. The protagonist drops the photo, trembling, but the image burns into their mind. The more they examine the contents of the hidden cavity, the more the protagonist realizes these items were not merely stored. They were kept, collected, preserved as if the house wanted to hold onto something from each of its victims, or perhaps needed to keep a piece of them to maintain its power. The panel was not sealed to hide them, it was sealed to protect them, like offerings the house refuses to release. The protagonist wonders how many panels like this exist within the walls, how many lives are catalogued in secret compartments throughout the shifting structure. The realization settles heavily, the house has a history that is not written anywhere, a lineage of trapped souls whose presence lingers in whispers and movements beneath the floorboards. The protagonist begins to understand that they are not the first to experience the shifting walls, the whispering voices, the impossibility of escape. The house has done this before, many times. The objects are silent testimonies to those who tried and failed to leave. Each date marks the span of their struggle, as short as a month, indicating how long the house allowed them to survive before claiming them entirely. The discovery changes the atmosphere of the house. What was once eerie becomes suffocating. What was once unsettling becomes malicious. The protagonist feels the shift immediately, as though the house resents being exposed. The floorboards creak more sharply, responding with irritated pops and shudders. The shadows seem to cling longer at the edges of vision. Even the air tastes different, metallic and thick, as if the house is breathing harder, adjusting its grip on its newest occupant. The protagonist tries to leave the hallway, but each step feels heavier, as though the ground beneath them grows denser, pulling them downward. The objects in the cavity seem to whisper faintly, their shapes vibrating with an unseen energy. The child's toy tilts on its side without being touched. The ring trembles against the wooden surface. The photograph shifts slightly as though a breeze touches it, though the air remains perfectly still. They feel the weight of the past pressing against their chest, suffocating any lingering hope they had of survival or escape. In this moment, the protagonist understands that the house does not simply trap people. It consumes them in ways that are slow and deliberate. The discovery of the previous tenants is not merely a revelation, it is a warning, left behind by those who could not speak in any other way. It marks the point where fear transforms into the chilling certainty that the house has plans for them too, and that their time has already begun to count down. The final revelation of the house's intent unfolds slowly, like a predator circling closer, allowing its presence to be felt long before it chooses to strike. It begins with a subtle shift in the air, a heaviness that presses down on the protagonist's shoulders as though the entire structure is leaning inward. The walls, once merely unsettling, now pulse faintly with a rhythm that feels disturbingly like breath. The house is no longer content to hide behind creaking boards and shifting corridors, it begins to reveal itself not as a place haunted by memories, but as the very source of those memories, a sentient entity with needs, desires, and a long-nurtured hunger that reaches into every corner of its architecture. The protagonist senses this shift with growing dread, understanding that every whisper, every movement, every alteration has been leading to this moment, the moment the house decides to claim them entirely. It starts with the sound of a heartbeat, faint and slow, pulsing through the floorboards beneath their feet. At first, the protagonist believes it is their own pulse echoing in their ears, amplified by fear, but the rhythm is too steady, too powerful, resonating from deep within the structure. They press their hand against the wall and feel it thump gently against their palm, as if something enormous and ancient slumbers within the wooden bones of the house. With each beat, a subtle vibration travels through the floor, stirring dust into the air. It is not a human heartbeat. It is deeper, slower, and carries an unyielding certainty, the beat of something that has existed for longer than any person who stepped inside. The realization crawls up the protagonist's spine, the house is alive. As they move from room to room, the heartbeat grows louder, guiding their steps like a law. The protagonist tries to resist, tries to turn away, but the shifting walls funnel them in a single direction. Doorways that once led to familiar places now open into unfamiliar corridors bathed in dim, pulsing light. The air grows warmer, thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood. Each breath the protagonist takes feels like inhaling the breath of the house itself, a constant reminder that they are inside something that breathes, something that watches, something that expects. The whispers, once scattered and fragmented, merge into a single collective murmur, rising from the walls, floors, and ceiling in layered, overlapping voices that form broken fragments of emotion, pleading, warning, welcoming, mourning. They speak not as individual spirits, but as one collective consciousness trapped within the structure. The protagonist tries to block the sound by covering their ears, but the whispers are not heard with the ears. They vibrate through the bones, the air, and the mind. The voices speak of time, of being consumed, of becoming part of the house's heartbeat. It becomes clear that the house does not kill in physical ways, it absorbs. It draws in the essence of those who become trapped within it, weaving their fears, memories, and souls into its architecture. The shifting walls are not tricks, they are the result of many lives, compressed and reshaped into a living labyrinth. The whispers, once thought to be voices from beneath the floorboards, are the echoes of previous victims who have long since lost their individuality, their desperation blending into one endless murmur. The protagonist realizes that the house has been studying them, adapting to their fears, learning what weakens them. Every whisper that called their name, every footstep that mimicked their movements, every vanished door was a test, a way for the house to understand how best to break them down. It never intended to let them leave, it only intended to draw them deeper into its core, to erode their sense of reality until resistance becomes impossible. The objects found behind the hidden panel begin to make sense. They are remnants of others who were taken in and absorbed, the final traces of people who once fought, resisted, pleaded. The house keeps these fragments the way a creature keeps trophies, reminders of the lives it has claimed. As they are guided closer to the heartbeat source, the protagonist notices the walls beginning to shift in more organic ways. The wood bends subtly, forming shapes that resemble ribs or tendons. The floorboards ripple faintly beneath their feet like muscles adjusting under pressure. The protagonist stumbles, feeling the house tighten around them, each movement becoming harder as though the air itself thickens with intent. The pulsing grows louder, faster now, as though the house senses their fear climaxing and responds with anticipation. The whispers rise together, swelling in a crescendo that vibrates through the walls and into the protagonist's skull. They reach a room they do not recognize, a room that could not have existed before because it feels too central, too vital. The air is warm and humid, and the light pulses softly, synchronized with the deep, rhythmic thumping. In the center of the room lies a hollow in the floor, a dark opening that breathes, inhaling and exhaling faint gusts of warm air. The wood around it is smoother, darker, polished by age and something else, something like touch. The protagonist feels pulled toward it, not physically but mentally, as if a strong, invisible hand guides their thoughts. The whispers urge, beckon, soothe, promising surrender, peace, release from fear. Beneath those deceptive promises, the protagonist senses the truth: the house hungers for consciousness, not bodies. It wants the mind, the terror, the emotional residue of its victims to extend its awareness, to feed the entity that lives within the walls. They stagger backward, fighting the pull with every ounce of will left, realizing that this is the final test. If they fall into the hollow, they will become another whisper among many. The walls react to their resistance, trembling with irritation. The floorboards tighten like clenched teeth, buckling slightly to trap their feet. The house no longer pretends to be subtle. It begins to close in, reducing the space around them, pressing them toward the breathing hollow. The protagonist gasps for breath, feeling the air thicken as though the house tries to fill their lungs with its own breath. Their heartbeat races, clashing violently with the slow, resonant pulse beneath the floor. For a moment, the two rhythms align, and the protagonist feels their sense of self blur at the edges, their thoughts slipping toward a collective that is not their own. The terror reaches a sharp, unbearable height as they fight to retain their identity, to resist being absorbed into the living consciousness of the house. The entity presses harder, whispering through every board, promising that resistance is pointless, that all who enter eventually become part of its walls, its breath, its memory. The protagonist feels their strength weaken, not physically, but mentally, the way a nightmare pulls someone deeper with soft, insistent hands. The house reveals its final and most horrifying truth: it does not merely trap people. It thrives on them, grows stronger with each mind it consumes, each fear it absorbs, each voice swallowed into its eternal whispering chorus. The forest fell into a strange silence, the kind that felt stitched together by something unseen, something watching. Lena stood frozen where the old path ended, her breath ghosting in the cold air as though even the wind refused to go farther. Behind her, Isaac's lantern flickered weakly, its trembling glow barely holding back the shadows pressing in from every direction. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run, to forget everything they had uncovered, yet something deeper, older, pulled them onward. The ground beneath their feet trembled softly, not like an earthquake, but like something beneath the soil had shifted its position, acknowledging their arrival after years of waiting. The whisper they had heard for nights, soft, stretched, almost human, rose again, curling through the branches like a thread being drawn too slowly. This time, the voice no longer tried to hide its shape. It was clearer, closer, purposeful. Lena felt the sound brush against the inside of her mind, cold and damp like a hand reaching from underwater. Isaac lifted the lantern higher, and its light struck the ruins of the forgotten cabin ahead, the one that appeared on no map but haunted every story the elders refused to finish. Its walls sagged inward, but the door, impossibly, stood straight, untouched by rot, as though it had been waiting for someone to cross it. They stepped forward, the lantern light stretching long shadows across the clearing. The whispering grew into layers, hundreds of strained breaths murmuring at once, overlapping in desperate harmony. Isaac's hands trembled, but Lena grabbed the rusted handle before she could think twice. The moment her skin touched the metal, the entire forest seemed to inhale. The trees leaned inward. The earth held its breath. Even the darkness stilled, as though bowing. Then, slowly, soundlessly, the door swung open on its own. A wave of cold rushed out so dense it felt like stepping into a memory that wanted to erase them. Inside the cabin, the air shimmered faintly, distorting the shapes of everything within. Lena could see the table, the old chair, the collapsed hearth, but they flickered as though fighting to stay visible. Isaac whispered her name, but it sounded far away, as if spoken through a long tunnel. She stepped inside anyway. Something compelled her. Something that felt familiar, like a voice she should have remembered from childhood but had somehow forgotten. The floor groaned under their weight, and the cabin door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook dust from the rafters. Isaac whirled around, pounding his fists against the wood, but the door didn't move even a fraction. The lantern dimmed. Shadows pooled along the floorboards, crawling upward like ink-seeking flesh. Then the whispering stopped, all at once, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like being plunged underwater. A moment later, a new sound emerged, a slow, deliberate dragging from the far corner of the cabin. Lena's breath locked in her chest as the darkness in the corner thickened. It rose, gathering shape the way smoke clings and folds into itself. Limbs began to form, long and thin, bending wrong in the joints. A face, or something trying to be a face, leaned forward, stitched together from strands of shadow, its features blurred as though they were not meant for human eyes. Isaac stumbled back, clutching the lantern, but its flame winked out entirely, leaving only the glow of its dying ember. The creature moved, but not with sound. It slid, glided, barely touching the ground, pausing inches from Lena. The air around her collapsed inward, cold enough to scrape the warmth from her bones. She couldn't speak. Couldn't think. All she could do was watch as the thing lifted its hollow gaze to hers, a gaze that felt like falling into a bottomless well. A shape unfolded from its reach, an object small and delicate, wrapped in something that looked like faded cloth. It extended the bundle toward her, trembling with a weight that seemed impossible. Lena's hand lifted on its own. When her fingers brushed the cloth, her vision flickered, no longer seeing the cabin but flashes of what had been lost to time, a woman running through the forest with a child in her arms, a door slammed shut against a storm of voices, a ritual half completed, a scream swallowed by the walls. Then she saw herself, not as she was now, but younger, standing in this cabin doorway, staring at the same bundle. The realization struck her with a force that cracked something inside. The cabin had called her home. It had always been her story. Her beginning. Her inheritance. The creature stepped back, retreating into the corner as the walls began to shake violently. Isaac grabbed her arm, shouting something she couldn't hear, but the sound was eaten by the roaring wind rising from beneath the floorboards. The lantern hit the ground, shattering. A torrent of whispers flooded the cabin again, swirling around them like a storm trying to tear them apart. The floor splintered. The beams moaned. The door finally burst open, slamming against the outside wall. The forest howled. Lena held the bundle tight against her chest as the ground gave way beneath them. Isaac reached for her hand. She reached back. Their fingers brushed once, briefly, before the cabin plunged into darkness, swallowing everything: light, air, sound, their names, until nothing remained except the whisper of the forest closing over the clearing, sealing the story the way it had sealed every one before it.